Way back in 2015, I made a video series titled How to Fly an FPV Racing Drone. And in that video series, here they are, I took you through the process of learning how to fly. You've just got an FPV drone, you've got a controller, you've got some goggles, but you don't actually know how to fly the damn thing. And a lot of times people learn to fly just by throwing themselves up against the wall until they finally start to figure it out. And that works, but it's not the most efficient way to do it. The most efficient way to do it is to have somebody who has taught a lot of people how to fly an FPV drone take you through the process in a methodical and organized way that builds up skills and gets you to the point where you're flying the drone as quickly as possible. This is that video series. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. As excited as I am to get you flying as soon as possible, and I hope you're excited too, we're going to take care of just a little bit of bookkeeping before we get into the substance of the video. The first thing I need to tell you is that this video series is going to be a playlist. It's not just going to be one long video. It's going to be several videos, each of them focusing on one particular skill, and you can work through them at your own pace. Don't force yourself to just search YouTube for these videos. I have made a playlist. All these videos are in a playlist. There's a link to the playlist in the video description below. As well, I'll put a card on screen to that playlist. Save the link to the playlist somewhere so you can find it and work your way through the videos at your own pace instead of having to search around and hope the YouTube algorithm decides to show them to you. We are going to be learning using the Liftoff FPV Drone Simulator. And there's two things I want to say about that. First of all, why are we using a simulator? Why are we not outside flying a real drone? Well, number one, it's a whole lot easier for me to record these tutorials sitting in front of a computer. And number two, it is a whole lot more effective for you to learn in the simulator. Many people, when they are first starting out, very much want to fly a real drone. But here's the secret. As soon as you start flying, unless you're just very exceptional, you're just going to start crashing. You're going to crash so much. And it's going to take a lot of crashing before you start to actually kind of get good and be able to fly. The actual amount of time it takes somebody to get to the point where they can basically just kind of fly around varies. Sometimes it's just a few hours. Sometimes it's maybe 20 or 30 hours. It just depends. And the simplest and most effective way to put that time in is on the simulator. Because in the simulator, when you crash, it doesn't cost you any money. You don't have to fix your quad. You don't even have to walk and go pick your quadcopter up. All you have to do is hit the reset button and start over again. There are ways in which the simulator doesn't fly like a real quad, but at the very beginning of learning to fly, those ways just don't matter. And the simulator is the most effective way to learn. I strongly recommend everyone learning to fly start in the simulator before they fly their real quad. The other question you might be wondering is, why are we using the Liftoff simulator? And do you have to use the Liftoff simulator? And the answer to that is, number one, we're using it just because I like it. There are other simulators out there that I fly sometimes, and I like them too, but I'm kind of partial to the Liftoff simulator in part because they built my house as a level in there, and it's awful fun to fly around my house. And I don't know. If you decide not to use the Liftoff simulator, you 100% can do all of the things we're going to do in this tutorial. If you have another simulator that you like to use, or if you want to use a free simulator, Liftoff does cost money. If you choose to use a free simulator, I suggest the FPV Skydive simulator, which is also available on Steam. It's pretty good and it doesn't cost any money. But we're going to go ahead and start up the Liftoff simulator. And the very first thing we need to do is get our controller working with the simulator. I am going to suggest that you use a real FPV controller and not like an Xbox or PlayStation game controller. If you have a game controller and that's all that you have, you can use them. They will work. But the sticks on a real FPV controller, they're longer joysticks and you can make more precise movements. And I know what you're thinking. I make plenty of precise movements playing games on my Xbox or PlayStation or whatever. I can be precise with it. Those games are designed around that controller. And FPV drones are not designed around that controller. Those little short stubby joysticks do not have the same precision and they're more difficult to use. So I'm going to have a list down in the video description to a couple of controllers you might consider getting. The cheapest one is only about 40 or 50 bucks. The one I actually recommend is in the range of about 100 bucks. And of course, you can always spend more money if you decide to. This controller is going to stick with you throughout your FPV journey. So think of it as an investment. And if you spend 50 bucks or 100 bucks on it now, and 2 weeks from now you decide this was all a big mistake, you could probably sell it and get some of that money back. The controller that I'm using in this video is the Radiomaster Boxer. And if you decide to get that one, again, there's a link in the video description below where you can pick it up. But whatever controller you get, I'm going to strongly recommend that it runs the OpenTX or EdgeTX operating system. OpenTX and EdgeTX are an open source operating system. Think of it like when you go to buy a computer, you buy a computer and it runs Mac OS or maybe it runs Windows. And whatever brand of computer you buy, if it runs Windows, it's going to sort of work the same way. It doesn't matter who made it. Same thing is true for these controllers. There are other controllers out there from manufacturers like Futaba or Spectrum or RadioLink. I don't recommend that you get one of those. They don't run the OpenTX and EdgeTX operating system, and I'm going to suggest you go with one of the ones listed in the video description below, or any one that runs the OpenTX or EdgeTX operating system. And one reason that's important is because if you are using a radio that runs the OpenTX or EdgeTX operating system, then the things I'm going to show you right now when we set up the controller will be pretty much the same, even if you have a radio that looks slightly different than mine. And the first thing I want you to do is create a new model on your radio specifically for use with the simulator. You can see I've already done this, and mine is named Joystick. And the idea is that you're going to have a certain way that the controller is set up for use with flying your actual drones. And then when you go to the simulator, it may not need to be set up the exact same way. And so you're going to have a separate model that holds those settings for use with the simulator or use with your actual drones. The way that we can do this on the Boxer is to long press the model key, which takes us to our model select screen. We're going to choose an empty slot. For me, the first empty slot is slot 5, and I'm going to click the jog wheel, and that's going to give me the option to create a new model. Once the model is created, that's really all you need to do. You'll see also that there is a star next to that model, indicating that model is selected, and that's what we want. If you want to, you can press the page key one time and go to the setup screen to put in a model name, and you can name it Joystick or whatever you want to name it by clicking the jog wheel, scrolling the jog wheel to select a letter, and then clicking the jog wheel to lock in that letter. This is a slow and painful and annoying process, but you can do it if you really want to. Once you've created that model and selected it, the next thing we need to do is connect the radio to our computer. And we're going to do that using this USB port on the top of the radio. Please note that the Boxer has a USB port both on the bottom and on the top. The bottom one is for charging, the top one is for use with a computer. Some radios will only have one USB port that is used both for charging and for the computer. You'll just need to kind of look at your radio and figure out if it has 2 USB ports or just one. When I plug in USB, I'm going to get a message pop up on screen, select mode, and I need to select which mode the USB connection is going to be in. I'm going to choose the USB joystick option. You can just scroll the jog wheel, highlight USB joystick, and click the jog wheel. And when I do that, liftoff may detect that a new joystick has been detected. That's what we would ideally like to see. The next thing I'm going to do is click Options, Controls, and Controller. The next thing you're going to do is click Calibrate. And we're going to go through this manual calibration process. The process is time sensitive. You need to complete each step before the timer runs out. And if you miss a step, you'll have to stop and start over. So I'm going to go through this, and I want you to watch me go through it, and then you can go through it as well. I'm going to click Start Calibration, and I'm going to move the 2 joysticks in circles, and that's going to tell it which channels are being output by the joystick. Then I'm going to center the sticks. Then I'm going to push the throttle up, and that's going to be the left stick, and then recenter the sticks. And then I'm going to push the pitch axis up, and that's going to be the right stick, pushed forward and center the sticks. And then I'm going to push the roll axis to the right, and that's going to be the right stick, pushed to the right and center the sticks. And I'm going to push the yaw axis to the right, and that's going to be the left stick to the right and center the sticks. And when that is done, I can test that the quadcopter is moving correctly. So, center those sticks. And are we done? I think we're done now. Okay. Now we've finished calibration, let's check that things are working correctly. If I lower the throttle, that is the left stick, if I move it down, the drone moves down, and if I move it up, the drone moves up. And also I can see on screen that the stick on the controller on screen is doing the same thing that my controller in real life is doing. If I push the left stick to the left and to the right, the quad moves on the yaw axis. If I push the right stick to the left and the right, the quad moves on the roll axis. And if I push the right stick forward and back, it moves on the pitch axis. Yours should be doing exactly like mine. There's one more setting that you might want to add, and that is deadband. Deadband is going to be especially useful if you have a controller where the gimbals are not the best and they don't always recenter the best. We specifically see that users of the TBS Tango and TBS Mambo radios need some deadband, as well as if you just have an older or cheaper radio where the gimbals are a little worn out. If you find that the gimbals are sort of drifting and not returning to center over time, you can go in and you can click Fine Tune, and you can add a little bit of deadband. And this is the deadband slider here. A good amount of deadband to add is 0.05. There's no reason to add deadband on the throttle, though. You could add deadband on the throttle doesn't center, so it's not affected by deadband. We can add deadband on the roll, pitch, and yaw axes if you run into that problem, where as you're flying, the quadcopter is kind of drifting, even though the stick is centered. For now, I'm not gonna add deadband because my gimbals are fine. If you're not sure, I would suggest you add a little bit of deadband, and later you could try removing it once you're a little bit more experienced as a pilot and can really tell when things are wrong and when things are right. Go ahead and hit save. When you're done, the calibration will be saved and we should be ready to go. I will exit out to the main menu now, and we will begin with the very first exercise. Oh, by the way, you may have noticed that I don't have any music playing, and you have music playing, probably. If you like the music that the game is playing, great, enjoy it. After about 27 hours of flying, you'll get tired of it. At least I did. You can go into options and you can go to audio and you can turn the music off, which I have done. The next thing I want you to do is go into Steam, not Liftoff, but Steam, and click Settings. And I want you to go down to the in-game setting, and I want you to enable the in-game FPS counter. I like to put it in the top right. The reason for that is that the feel and the physics of the simulator are heavily affected by the frame rate. If your frame rate is too low, the physics won't feel good. So we always want to be keeping an eye on that frame rate, especially if you maybe have a little bit of a low-spec computer. With that in-game FPS counter enabled, you may need to restart the game in order to get that to activate. You should see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen a frame per second counter. And you want that frame per second counter to be as high as possible. That's the short version. I'm getting 60 FPS, which is the absolute minimum that you want to see. Obviously, when we actually start playing the game, the frame rate may change. We're just in the menu right now. So you're going to want to keep an eye on that. And we can go into options and we can change some of the graphics options to make that higher. One thing you're going to want to do is have the VSync turned off. That is going to decrease the latency of the simulator, and you may need to decrease the resolution if you're not getting a high enough frame rate. You can also decrease the quality setting from fantastic, which is the best, all the way down to maybe fast or fastest. Your graphics will look worse, but that doesn't matter. We're not here to look at the game. We're here to learn how to fly. You're going to want to also make sure that limit frame rate is off and you have unlimited frame rate so you get the fastest frame rate possible. With that being done, we can go to single player, free flight, and we can load up a level and do the very first exercise. We're going to do that exercise on the straw bale map, and we're going to click no track because we're not going to be racing yet. We're just learning how to fly. I want you to make sure that here on the left, you have official blueprints selected instead of any customized drones that you might have made or maybe not. And we're going to go through the official blueprints and we're going to select, let's select the Ladrib Skyliner. This is a nice 5-inch freestyle quad that's going to be perfect for us to learn on. Notice now that my frame per second counter at the top is, oh my goodness, it's 250, 260 frames per second. We're out of the menu and the frame per second is now uncapped and ready to go. If you're not seeing at least 60 frames per second, hit the escape button, go to options and change some of those graphical options to try to get that frame counter up. You ideally want at least maybe 100 or 120 frames per second for the physics to feel the best. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to press the up and down arrow keys. And the up and down arrow keys will change your camera angle. We're not going to go too in depth on the effect of camera angle because I'd really just like to get you flying. But what I'd like you to do is lower your camera angle by pressing the down arrow key to about, let's say, 15 degrees. Ignore the fact that it's turned red. 15 degrees is a good camera angle for you to learn on. Every time you load the level, you're going to need to change that camera angle. I'll show you later in a later tutorial how to change that and lock the camera angle in permanently, but I really just want to get you into the exercise right now, so we're not going to do that right now. The other thing I want to show you is that if you press the A key, look in the upper left-hand corner of my screen, do you see it says acro? If I press the A key, it changes from acro to 3D, horizon, level, and back to acro again. You want to be in acro mode for these lessons, just in case you accidentally bump that key and mess it up. You will also see that on my screen, you can see my stick overlay at the lower center of my screen. So if we look at the camera here, we can see that as I raise the throttle, right, the stick is moving up and down. And if you look at the lower center of my screen, you can see that representation of the throttle going up and down. It is a very basic graphical depiction of my sticks, but most of the time, I'm going to want you to be looking at that stick overlay on screen, not looking at this camera. It's more precise. You can see more precisely what I'm doing with my fingers, and it's easier on the editor if he doesn't have to edit in a whole camera overlay. So I'm going to go ahead and take the controller over here, and we're just going to be looking at that stick overlay instead of at a camera. And here is the exercise that I would like you to do here at the beginning of the level. In this exercise, we're going to start to learn throttle management. This drone isn't like a DJI drone where it will automatically hold altitude for you. You have to manage the altitude by adjusting the throttle. The throttle controls the output speed of the motors. When you raise the throttle, the motors go faster and make more thrust. When you lower the throttle, the motors slow down and make less thrust. So what we can do is we can begin to raise the throttle, and you'll see that as I start to raise the throttle, you'll hear the motors speed up, but really nothing will happen. If I continue to raise the throttle ever so slowly, eventually we'll reach a point where the quadcopter begins to climb. You see, it's not climbing yet. We are not making enough thrust yet to overcome the weight of the quadcopter. If I keep raising that throttle, there we go. We found the point where we lift off of the ground. And now we're kind of bobbling around. This bobbling here, where we're not quite off the ground, but we're not quite flying yet either, is referred to as ground effect. And we're going to want to continue to raise the throttle until we climb up out of ground effect. And if I raise the throttle just slightly, now see, no, look, Mon, no hands, we are climbing. Don't worry about the fact that the quad is drifting. Do you see how I'm drifting towards the edge of the map? Who cares? Don't worry about that. All I want you to think about is the throttle and nothing else. That's why we're in the simulator. As I continue to drift off the map, that's fine. Eventually, I will drift far enough off the map that the game will reset me, or I can just lower the throttle and press the R key on my keyboard to reset. Now, we're going to do that again. We're just going to raise throttle until we lift into the air. There we go. And the first thing I want you to think about as you learn to take off is finding the hover point or the takeoff point of the quadcopter. So I'm going to reset again and lower the throttle. What I don't want to do is I don't want to raise the throttle into that position where I'm kind of in ground effect and bobbling and bouncing off the ground. That is that's bad for the quad, and doesn't look good. It doesn't fly good. It's not good. What I want to do is I want to raise the throttle to the point where the quad begins to climb and get it to definitively climb. There we go. Now I'm climbing, right? I found that point where I'm climbing. Don't take your hands off the sticks in real life when you're flying. We're in a simulator and I'm doing a demonstration, so it's okay. The very first thing we're going to work on is just being able to take off, to be able to raise the throttle and find that takeoff point and begin to climb. There we go. And you see the quad kind of jumps off the ground. When the quad is close to the ground, it pushes off the ground with the thrust and it gets extra thrust. But once it gets up in the air, it's only pushing on the air, and the air doesn't push back as hard as the ground. So it will kind of jump off the ground, and then you need to continue to raise the throttle just a little bit till it continues to climb. Now, you don't want to overdo it. So you don't want to just raise the throttle and shoot up into the air. That can be really impressive when you're hanging out with your friends, but it doesn't demonstrate good throttle control. You just want to raise the throttle till the quad begins to lift off, and then raise it a little bit more so we get out of ground effect and continue to climb. Okay. Once you've done that, the next step is going to be establishing a hover at a consistent altitude. And I don't even care what that altitude is. Do you see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there's an altitude and a speed indicator? I kind of don't even want you to look at that. Because in real life, you probably aren't going to have an altitude and a speed indicator. And even if you do, that's not how you know. Like when you're driving a car, assuming that you drive a car, which maybe some of you don't drive cars, but when you're driving a car, you're not like looking at your speedometer to find out how fast you're going. You're looking at the road. You're looking at the rest of the traffic. The only time you look at your speedometer is if you think, oh, am I about to get a speeding ticket? And the same is true with quads. We're not going to be relying on an altimeter to tell us how high we're going because these are acro and racing drones. They're probably not going to be high enough in the air that the numerical altitude actually matters. We're going to be looking at the environment around us. So in this case, I want you to look at the horizon off in the distance. And if I raise the throttle and begin to take off, you should see that the horizon moves downward in the screen. As I climb, the horizon gets lower. You can see the horizon moving up to reveal itself from behind the trees. And the trees are getting further and further below us. We want to judge our altitude based on those visual references, not based on an altimeter or any readout in the screen. And what I want you to do is I want you to climb to a certain point. Like, for example, let's just say we're going to climb to about the top of the trees. We're going to be level with the top of the trees. So I'm going to climb until it looks like the top of the trees are approximately in the center of my screen. That seems about right. And then we're going to adjust throttle up and down very slowly to try to hold that altitude without climbing or descending. And I want you to take a look. In fact, I'm going to put it on screen as a replay and kind of zoom it in. I want you to take a look at how microscopically small the motions of the throttle that I'm making are. To maintain altitude precisely requires extremely precise and small movements of the throttle. And this is something that as a beginner, you're going to struggle with, probably. Everyone struggles with it. So in the beginning, what'll happen is that you'll get to that altitude and oh, I'm climbing, and you'll lower the throttle. And you're like, oh, I'm falling, and you'll raise the throttle, and oh, I'm climbing, and you'll have these big kind of oscillations around the hover point that you're trying to achieve, the altitude that you're trying to achieve. And as you get better and better, you'll begin to anticipate what's happening and be able to make those smaller movements. In addition, your muscle control, your fine muscle control with the sticks and the gimbals will become more precise and more practiced, and you'll be able to make those very small movements. But in the beginning, this first exercise, what we want to do is just take off, climb to, let's say, the level of the trees, and then adjust the throttle to try to hold that altitude as precisely as we can. Don't worry about the fact that we're drifting forward and going to crash into the trees. It doesn't matter. That's why we're in the simulator. We just want to make very small adjustments of the throttle to try to hold that altitude. And of course, the ideal would be to perfectly hold that altitude at exactly the same altitude and to be able to just take your hand off the stick and float at, oh, I'm descending. See, I'm descending. I have to raise the throttle slightly. You're always making little adjustments on a quadcopter. You can really hardly ever just take your hands off the sticks and have it be perfectly balanced and hovering. See, now I'm climbing, right? Why am I drifting? I don't know. That's the beginning of this exercise. So that's what you're going to start working on. It's super boring, but it is going to get you to the good stuff faster. And so if you want to come along on this process with me, that's where you're going to start. Work on that for a while until you're ready to go on to part 2. And then you'll see you in part 2, which is linked in the playlist down in the video description or the card on screen. I'll see you there. Happy flying.